Jake Morrison wiped the sweat from his forehead as he looked across his dying ranch. The twin suns of New Montana burned overhead, casting strange purple shadows across the barren fields. His cattle were sick again, and he could see 3 more, lying motionless near the dried creek bed. This made 15 dead animals in the past month, and he only had 40 left. The ranch house behind him was falling apart. The roof leaked when the rare storms came, and the walls had cracks that let in the cold night air. Jake had tried to fix everything himself, but he was just one man with very little money and even fewer supplies. The nearest town was 3 days away by hover truck, and he could not afford to make the trip often. Jake walked over to the sick cattle and knelt beside a young bull that was breathing heavily. The animal's eyes were dull and cloudy, and foam came from its mouth. Jake had seen this sickness before, but he did not know what caused it or how to stop it. The veterinarian in town cost more money than Jake had, and the medicine was even more expensive. He stood up slowly, feeling the pain in his back from years of hard work. Jake was 35 years old, but he felt much older. His hands were rough and scarred from fixing fences and machinery. His face was burned dark by the alien suns, and deep lines showed around his eyes from squinting in the bright light. The corporate land buyers had been coming around more often lately. They wore expensive suits and drove shiny vehicles that cost more than Jake's entire ranch. They offered him money for his land, but it was not enough to start over somewhere else. They knew he was desperate, and they were waiting for him to fail completely so they could buy everything for almost nothing. Jake walked back to his house and opened the refrigerator. Inside were 2 protein bars and a bottle of recycled water. This was all the food he had left until his next supply run to town, which he could not afford to make for another week. He took 1 protein bar and saved the other for tomorrow. The bars tasted like cardboard, but they kept him alive. He sat down at his kitchen table and looked at the bills scattered across its surface. The power company wanted payment for the energy that ran his equipment. The water recycling system needed expensive filters. The hover truck needed new parts to keep running. Every piece of paper represented money he did not have and problems he could not solve. Outside his window, Jake could see the vast wilderness that stretched for hundreds of miles in every direction. New Montana was a frontier planet, and humans had only been here for 50 years. Most people lived in the big cities or worked for the mining companies. Very few tried to ranch or farm in the remote areas like Jake did. The planet was beautiful, but dangerous. Strange plants grew in the purple soil, and some of them were poisonous to earth animals. The weather changed quickly and violently. Electrical storms could fry equipment from miles away. During winter, the temperature dropped so low that water froze solid in minutes. Jake had come to New Montana with big dreams and enough money to buy this land and some cattle. He thought he could build a good life here, maybe even start a family, someday. But the planet fought him every step of the way. Crop diseases killed his first attempts at farming. Wild animals attacked his livestock. Equipment broke down constantly in the harsh environment. Now 5 years later, Jake was almost beaten. He had sold everything he could spare just to buy food and keep the power on. His hover truck was 20 years old and barely ran. His clothes were patched and worn. He had not been to town in months because he was ashamed of how he looked and could not afford to buy anything anyway. The loneliness was the worst part. Jake had not spoken to another human being in weeks. His communication device could reach the emergency channels, but regular calls to Earth cost too much money. He sometimes talked to his cattle just to hear a voice, even if it was his own. As the suns began to set, Jake went outside to check on his animals one more time. The sick bull had died while he was inside. Jake dragged the heavy body away from the others and marked the spot where he would bury it tomorrow. Burying the dead cattle was hard work, but leaving them out would attract predators. The night sky on New Montana was spectacular. 3 moons hung overhead and strange colored lights danced across the darkness. Jake had never gotten tired of looking up at the alien stars, even during his worst days. The beauty of the planet reminded him why he had come here in the first place. Jake went back inside and heated some water for a bath. He could only afford to heat water twice a week, so he made it count. The warm water felt good on his aching muscles, and for a few minutes he could forget about his problems. After his bath, Jake lay down on his bed and listened to the sounds of the night. Strange animals called to each other in the distance. The wind made the house creak and groan. Sometimes he heard the rumble of corporate mining vehicles working through the night, tearing up the land to extract valuable minerals. Jake knew he could not keep going much longer. The corporate buyers would get his land eventually, and he would have to find work in one of their mines or factories. The thought made him sick, but he was running out of choices. He had fought as hard as he could, but the planet and the corporations were stronger than one man. Before he fell asleep, Jake made a promise to himself. He would try for one more month. If things did not get better by then, he would accept defeat and sell the ranch. At least he could say he had given everything he had to make his dream work. The twin moon shined through his cracked window as Jake closed his eyes. He did not know that tomorrow would bring the storm that would change his life forever. He did not know that his greatest challenge would also become his greatest opportunity. For now, he was just a poor rancher trying to survive on a hostile alien world one day at a time. Jake woke up to the sound of thunder rolling across the sky. The walls of his house shook and bright flashes of lightning lit up his bedroom window. He jumped out of bed and looked outside. Dark clouds covered both suns, and the wind was bending the few trees around his ranch almost to the ground. This was not a normal storm. On New Montana, the electrical storms were different from anything on Earth. The lightning was purple and green, and it could destroy metal equipment from miles away. Jake had learned to respect these storms after losing his first generator to a lightning strike 3 years ago. The rain started falling hard, hitting his roof like bullets. Within minutes, water was pouring through the cracks and leaks, and Jake had to put pots and buckets around the house to catch it. The wind howled louder and louder, and he could hear pieces of his barn roof being torn away. Jake put on his heavy coat and boots and went outside to check on his cattle. The animals were huddled together near the old barn, trying to stay out of the wind and rain. Most of them looked scared but safe. He counted them quickly and saw that none were missing. The storm lasted for 6 hours. Jake spent most of that time moving buckets around his house and watching the lightning show through his windows. The electrical displays were beautiful, but dangerous. Each bolt that hit the ground sent shockwaves through the air that he could feel in his chest. When the storm finally passed, Jake went outside to see the damage. Part of his barn roof was gone, scattered across the field in twisted pieces of metal. His fence had several broken sections where falling debris had hit it. Worst of all, the small creek that ran along the edge of his property had become a raging river. Jake had never seen so much water in the creek before. Usually it was just a trickle, barely deep enough to water his cattle. Now it was 20 feet wide and flowing fast enough to knock down a grown man. The water was brown with mud and full of branches, rocks, and other debris carried down from the hills. He walked along the bank of the flooded creek, checking to see if any of his cattle had been caught by the rising water. The sound was incredible, like a freight train running through his property. Trees that had stood for decades were being uprooted and swept away by the current. That was when Jake heard the screaming. At first he thought it was just the wind, or maybe some wild animal caught in the storm. But then he heard it again, and this time he was sure. Someone was crying for help, and the sound was coming from the direction of the river. Jake ran toward the sound, jumping over fallen branches and sliding down the muddy bank. The rain had stopped, but the ground was still slippery and dangerous. He could hear the voices more clearly now. They sounded young and very scared. When he reached the edge of the swollen river, Jake saw them. 2 small figures were clinging to a large branch that had gotten stuck against some rocks in the middle of the current. They looked like children, but they were not human. Their skin was silver gray, and they had large golden eyes that reflected the light. Jake knew immediately what they were. These were Kethra, the native people of New Montana. He had heard about them but never seen any before. The government said they lived in the deep wilderness and did not like contact with humans. Most ranchers and miners were told to stay away from Kethra territory, but these were just children, probably no older than 7 or 8 years old. One was a girl who was holding tight to the branch with both hands. The other was a smaller boy who looked hurt or unconscious. The girl was trying to keep his head above water while holding on herself. The branch they were on was not stuck firmly. Jake could see it shifting in the current, and he knew it would break free soon. When that happened, both children would be swept downstream and probably killed. The water was too deep and fast for them to swim to shore. Jake did not think about the danger or about the fact that these were alien children who might not even want his help. He just knew that 2 young lives were in trouble, and he was the only person who could save them. He ran back to his hover truck and grabbed the emergency rope from the toolbox. The rope was 50 feet long and had a safety hook on one end. Jake had used it before to pull cattle out of mud holes, but never for anything like this. Jake tied one end of the rope around a strong tree and checked the knot twice. Then he wrapped the other end around his waist and waded into the river. The water was shockingly cold, and the current immediately tried to knock him down. Each step was a struggle against the rushing water and slippery rocks on the bottom. The water got deeper quickly. Soon Jake was swimming more than walking, fighting against the current that wanted to sweep him downstream. The rope around his waist was the only thing keeping him connected to shore. His heavy boots and coat made swimming much harder, but he did not have time to take them off. Jake reached the branch just as it started to break free from the rocks. The girl saw him coming and started talking rapidly in a language he did not understand. Her voice was high and frightened, but she seemed to realize that he was trying to help. The boy was definitely unconscious. His breathing was shallow, and there was blood on his forehead where he had hit something. Jake knew he had to get both children to shore quickly before the cold water made them all too weak to swim. Jake grabbed the branch with one hand and reached for the girl with the other. She was afraid to let go at first, but when the branch shifted again and nearly broke free, she grabbed his arm. Jake pulled her close to him and then reached for the boy. Getting back to shore was the hardest thing Jake had ever done. He had to swim against the current while holding 2 children and keeping all their heads above water. The rope helped, but his muscles were burning with effort. Several times he thought they would all be swept away. The girl tried to help by kicking her legs, but she was too small and scared to do much good. The boy was dead weight in Jake's arms, and Jake could feel his strength running out. The shore seemed impossibly far away, even though he knew it was only 30 feet. Finally, Jake's feet touched the bottom again. He stumbled through the shallow water and collapsed on the muddy bank, still holding both children. They were all soaked and freezing, but they were alive. The girl was crying and shivering. The boy was still unconscious but breathing. Jake knew he had to get them warm and dry quickly, or they might die from the cold. He picked up the boy and helped the girl to her feet. Then he led them up the bank toward his house, wondering what he had gotten himself into. Jake carried the unconscious boy while the girl limped beside him toward the ranch house. Her left leg was hurt, and she winced with each step, but she did not complain. Jake could see that she was trying to be brave, even though she was scared and cold. The boy in his arms was lighter than a human child would be, but his breathing was getting weaker. Jake could feel how cold his skin was through the wet clothes. If he did not get medical attention soon, he might not survive. The problem was that Jake had no real medical training and only basic first aid supplies. When they reached the house, Jake pushed open the front door and carried the boy straight to his bedroom. He laid him gently on the bed and started removing his wet clothes. The girl followed them and stood in the doorway, watching everything Jake did with her large golden eyes. Jake wrapped the boy in warm blankets and then went to get his medical kit from the bathroom. The kit was small and simple, containing bandages, antiseptic, pain medicine, and a few emergency tools. It was designed for treating cuts and broken bones, not for whatever was wrong with this child. The boy had a deep cut on his forehead that was still bleeding. Jake cleaned it carefully with antiseptic and put a bandage over it. The child's skin felt cold and clammy, and his lips were turning blue. Jake recognized the signs of hypothermia from his training courses on Earth. Jake turned up the heat in the house as high as it would go and brought more blankets from the closet. He also heated some water on the stove to make warm drinks. The girl was still standing in the doorway, shivering in her wet clothes and watching his every move. Jake turned to her and tried to communicate. He pointed to himself and said "Jake" slowly and clearly. Then he pointed to her with a questioning look. She seemed to understand what he was asking, because she touched her chest and made a sound that sounded like Zara. Jake repeated Zara and she nodded. Then he pointed to the boy and looked at her again. She said something that sounded like Kess, and her voice was sad and worried. Jake could tell that Kess was probably her brother, or at least someone she cared about very much. Jake gestured for Zara to come closer and then pointed to her wet clothes. He pantomimed taking them off and wrapping up in blankets. At first, she looked scared and backed away, but when Jake showed her the extra blankets and turned his back to give her privacy, she seemed to understand. While Zara changed clothes behind him, Jake checked on Kess again. The boy's breathing was a little stronger, but he was still unconscious. Jake wished he had better medicine or some way to contact a doctor, but his communication device could only reach emergency services in town, and they would never make it out here in time. Jake heard Zara moving around behind him and turned to see that she had wrapped herself in 2 blankets and was sitting on the floor near the bed. She was still shivering, and her eyes never left her brother's face. Jake could see how much she loved and worried about him. Jake went to the kitchen and came back with 2 cups of hot water with sugar mixed in. He gave one to Zara and tried to get Kess to drink some of the other, but the boy was too unconscious to swallow safely. Jake was worried that Kess might be hurt worse than just cold and cut. He tried to examine Kess more carefully, feeling for broken bones or other injuries. The boy's left arm felt wrong, and when Jake touched it gently, Kess groaned and moved slightly. Jake thought the arm might be broken or at least badly hurt. Jake had some medical nano patches in his emergency kit. They were expensive and he only had 3 of them, but they could help with pain and infection. Jake decided to use one on Kess, even though it meant he would have almost no medical supplies left for himself. Jake placed the nano patch on Kess's arm where he thought the injury was worst. The patch would release medicine slowly into the boy's system and help his body heal faster. It was the best Jake could do with what he had. Zara watched everything Jake did with great attention. When she saw him put the nano patch on her brother, she said something in her own language that sounded like a question. Jake tried to explain by pointing to the patch and then to Kess's arm and nodding to show it would help. After a few minutes, the nano patch began to work. Kess's breathing got stronger and some color came back to his face. He was still unconscious, but Jake felt more hopeful that he would recover. Jake brought some of his own clothes for Zara to wear since hers were still wet. His shirts were much too big for her, but they were warm and dry. She seemed grateful and said something that Jake thought might mean thank you in her language. As the hours passed, Jake tried to learn more about his unexpected guests. Through gestures and simple drawings, he figured out that they had been swept away from their home by the flood. Zara drew pictures of trees and hills that Jake thought might be the deep forest areas to the north. Jake drew a picture of his ranch and pointed around the house to show where they were now. Then he drew the river and made gestures to show how the storm had caused the flood. Zara seemed to understand and nodded sadly. Jake shared his last protein bar with Zara, breaking it in half even though it was all the food he had until his next trip to town. Zara ate it slowly and carefully, like someone who understood what it meant to be hungry. She offered half of her half back to Jake, but he shook his head and smiled to show she should keep it. As evening approached, Kess began to wake up. His eyes opened slowly, and he looked around in confusion. When he saw Zara, he said something weakly in their language. She answered quickly and pointed to Jake, obviously trying to explain what had happened. Kess looked at Jake with fear and curiosity mixed together. Jake smiled and spoke softly, trying to show that he was not dangerous. He pointed to himself and said, "Jake," just like he had with Zara. Kess did not try to say the name, but he did not look quite as scared. Jake brought some warm water for Kess to drink. The boy was able to sit up a little with Zara's help and take small sips. His arm was still hurt, but the nano patch seemed to be helping with the pain. As night fell, Jake made beds for both children in his living room near the fireplace. He gave them all his spare blankets and pillows to make sure they would be warm enough. Zara helped her brother walk slowly from the bedroom to his makeshift bed. Jake sat in his kitchen chair where he could watch over them during the night. He was tired from the rescue and worried about what would happen next. He knew that the Kethra adults would be looking for these children, and he had heard stories that they did not trust humans. But looking at Zara and Kess sleeping peacefully by his fireplace, Jake felt good about what he had done. They were just children who had needed help, and he had been able to save them. Whatever happened next, at least they were alive and safe for now. Jake did not sleep much that night. He kept checking on the children and listening for sounds outside. He had a feeling that morning would bring visitors, and he was not sure if they would be friendly or dangerous. Jake sat in his old chair by the window watching over the two sleeping children. Zara was curled up close to her brother, one small hand resting on his shoulder as if making sure he was still there. Kes was breathing much better now, and the color had returned to his face. Every hour, Jake got up quietly to check on them. He touched their foreheads to make sure they did not have fevers and listened to their breathing. The nano patch on Kes's arm seemed to be working well. The swelling had gone down, and the boy had not cried out in pain for several hours. Around midnight, Kes woke up and looked around in confusion. When he saw Jake sitting nearby, he did not seem afraid anymore. Jake brought him some water and helped him sit up to drink it. Kes said something softly to his sister, and she woke up immediately. Zara sat up and looked at Jake with her large golden eyes. She said something to him in her language, and though he could not understand the words, her tone sounded like she was trying to thank him. Jake smiled and nodded to show he understood her meaning. Jake went to his kitchen and looked through his supplies again. He still had some dried fruit that he had been saving for emergencies, and he decided this qualified. He brought it back and offered some to both children. They ate it slowly and seemed to enjoy the sweet taste. While they ate, Jake tried to learn more about them through gestures and simple drawings. He drew pictures of adults and pointed to the children with a questioning look. Zara understood and drew what looked like a man with long hair and some kind of clothing that might be armor or ceremonial dress. Jake realized she was probably drawing their father or another adult who would be looking for them. He drew more adults around the first one and held up his fingers to ask how many people might be coming. Zara looked worried and held up both hands several times, indicating a large number. This made Jake nervous. He had heard that the Kethra were warriors, and that they protected their territory fiercely. If a group of adult Kethra came looking for these children and found them with a human, they might think Jake had kidnapped them or hurt them in some way. Jake tried to communicate to Zara that he wanted to help get them back to their family safely. He drew pictures showing the children going home and made gestures to show that he would help them get there. Zara seemed to understand, but she looked worried about something. She drew more pictures showing what looked like the river and the storm. Then she drew the path from her home to where they were now, and Jake could see it was very far. Even if the children were feeling better, they would not be strong enough to make such a long journey on foot. As the night went on, Jake noticed that Zara was getting more comfortable around him. She started trying to say his name, though it came out sounding like Jacques because of the way her people spoke. When Jake repeated her name correctly, she smiled for the first time since he had rescued them. Kes was still weak and sleepy, but he was definitely getting better. The nanopatch was doing its job, and Jake thought the boy's arm was probably just badly bruised rather than broken. He would be sore for days, but he should heal completely. Around 3 a.m, Jake heard sounds outside that made him freeze. It was not the normal sounds of the night animals or the wind. It sounded like movement, careful and deliberate, coming from multiple directions around his house. Jake went to his window and looked out into the darkness. At first he could not see anything unusual, but then he spotted a shadow moving near, his barn that was too big and too purposeful to be an animal. His heart started beating faster as he realized what this probably meant. The Kethra had found them. Jake woke up Zara gently and pointed toward the window. She listened for a moment, and then her eyes went wide. She said something quickly to Kes, who tried to sit up despite his weakness. Both children looked scared but also relieved, as if they knew help had arrived but were worried about what would happen next. Jake went to his closet and got his rifle. He did not want to fight anyone, but he also did not want to be helpless. If the Kethra thought he was a threat, he made sure the weapon was loaded but kept the safety on. He hoped he would not need to use it. The sounds outside were getting closer. Jake could hear what sounded like many people moving around his property, in an organized way. They were surrounding the house, which meant they were either being very careful or preparing for some kind of attack. Zara came over to Jake and tugged on his shirt. She pointed to herself and then to the door, making gestures that seemed to mean she wanted to go outside and talk to whoever was out there. Jake shook his head firmly. He did not want her to get caught in the middle if there was going to be trouble. Jake looked through his binoculars out the front window and finally saw them clearly. Dark figures were positioned all around his property, standing perfectly still, like statues. He counted at least 20 that he could see, and he was sure there were more hiding in places he could not spot. They were definitely Kethra warriors. Even in the darkness, Jake could see they were taller and more muscular than humans, and they carried weapons that looked advanced and dangerous. They wore what looked like armor made from natural materials, and their movements were coordinated, like a military unit. As dawn began to break over the horizon, Jake could see more details. The warriors were not attacking or even approaching the house. They were just waiting, maintaining their positions around the property like they were keeping watch. Jake realized they probably knew their children were inside and were trying to figure out what kind of situation they were dealing with. Jake counted the warriors he could see and estimated there were close to 100 of them. This was not just a search party or a few concerned parents. This was a serious military force, and Jake was beginning to understand just how important these two children must be. Zara kept trying to go to the window to look outside, and Jake finally let her. When she saw the warriors, she said something that sounded excited and relieved. She pointed to one group of figures and said what might have been a name. Jake guessed she could see someone she recognized, probably her father or another family member. Kes managed to stand up with his sister's help and look outside too. Despite his injuries, his face lit up when he saw the warriors. Both children were clearly happy to see their people, but they also kept looking at Jake with expressions he could not quite read. Jake realized that the next few minutes would determine whether he lived or died. The Kethra had come in force to get their children back, and they would judge him based on how he handled this first contact. He had to show them that he was not a threat, and that he had only wanted to help. As the sun rose higher, Jake could see one figure walking toward the house while the others remained in position. This warrior was bigger than the others and wore more elaborate armor. Jake was sure this must be the leader and probably the children's father. Jake took a deep breath and made his decision. He put down his rifle and walked toward the front door. Zara grabbed his arm and said something urgently in her language, but Jake gently moved her hand away. He had to face whatever was coming and hope that his actions during the night had proven his good intentions. Jake opened the door and stepped outside to meet the approaching warrior, knowing that the next few moments would change his life forever. The warrior approaching Jake's house was massive, standing at least 7 feet tall with broad shoulders and long silver hair that fell past his shoulders. His armor was made from what looked like scales or shells, polished to a dark shine and decorated with intricate patterns. In his hands he carried a weapon that hummed with energy and glowed with a soft blue light. Jake stood in his doorway with his hands visible at his sides, trying to look as non-threatening as possible. Behind him he could hear Zara and Kes moving around, probably getting ready to run to their people. The morning air was cold, and Jake's breath made small clouds as he waited for the warrior to reach him. The Kethra leader stopped about 10 feet away from Jake and studied him carefully. His eyes were the same golden color as the children's, but they were hard and suspicious. Jake could feel the weight of that stare and knew that this warrior was deciding whether he was friend or enemy. Behind the leader, Jake could now see the full extent of the war party that had surrounded his property. There were exactly 100 warriors, all armed and armored, positioned in perfect formation around his ranch. Some stood on high ground where they could watch for threats. Others were hidden behind cover where they could attack quickly if needed. It was the most organized military display Jake had ever seen. The leader spoke, and his voice was deep and commanding. To Jake's surprise, the words were in Terran Standard, though spoken with a strong accent that made some sounds different from what Jake was used to. "Human, I am Chief Theron of the Mountain Clans. You have something that belongs to me." Jake felt relief that they could communicate, but also increased nervousness. Chief Theron's tone was not friendly, and the way he gripped his weapon suggested he was ready to use it. Jake chose his words carefully. If you mean the two children, they're safe inside. I pulled them from the river during the storm yesterday. They were drowning. Chief Theron's eyes narrowed. And what do you want in return for their lives, human? The question caught Jake off guard. He had not even thought about wanting anything in return. Nothing. They needed help, so I helped them. Chief Theron's expression did not change, but Jake sensed surprise in the way the warrior's grip on his weapon shifted slightly. Behind the chief, some of the other warriors moved restlessly, as if they had expected a different answer. Nothing? Chief Theron repeated. You risk your life to save Kethra children and want nothing? This is not the way of your people that we have observed. Jake was not sure what to say to that. He knew that many humans on New Montana were only interested in profit and getting rich from the planet's resources. The mining companies and land speculators had probably given the Kethra a bad impression of his species. I'm not like them, Jake said simply. I just saw two kids in trouble. Before Chief Theron could respond, Zara appeared in the doorway beside Jake. She said something quickly in the Kethra language, and Jake could hear excitement and relief in her voice. Chief Theron's entire demeanor changed when he saw her. Hardness left his eyes and he took a step forward. Zara ran to her father and threw her arms around his waist. Chief Theron dropped his weapon and hugged her tightly, saying something soft in their language. Jake could see the love and relief on the warrior's face, and it made him realize that beneath the armor and weapons, this was just a father who had been terrified for his children. Kes appeared in the doorway too, moving slowly because of his injuries. When Chief Theron saw his son's bandaged head and the way he favored his hurt arm, the warrior's expression grew dark again. He looked at Jake with renewed suspicion. What happened to my son? Jake explained about finding them clinging to the branch in the flood, about Kes being unconscious when he pulled them from the water, and about treating his injuries with the medical supplies he had. Chief Theron listened carefully, and Jake noticed that several other warriors had moved closer to hear the conversation. Zara spoke up again, talking rapidly to her father and pointing at Jake several times. Jake could not understand the words, but her tone seemed to be defending him. Kes added something too, his voice weaker but equally earnest. Chief Theron knelt down to examine his son's injuries. He carefully touched the bandage on Kes's head and looked at the nanopatch on his arm. When he saw the medical device, his eyebrows rose in surprise. This is expensive human medicine, he said to Jake. You used it on a Kethra child? He was hurt and cold. I had to do something to help him. Chief Theron stood up and faced Jake again. The suspicion was still there, but it was mixed with something else now. Jake thought it might be confusion or even a little respect. My children tell me you shared your food with them and gave them warm clothes. They say you stayed awake all night to watch over them and make sure they were safe. Jake nodded. They were scared and hurt. It was the right thing to do. The right thing to do, Chief Theron repeated slowly, as if the concept was foreign to him when applied to humans. He looked at Jake for a long moment, and Jake could almost see him trying to figure out what kind of person would act this way. One of the other warriors approached and spoke quietly to Chief Theron in their language. Jake caught a few words that sounded angry or urgent. Chief Theron responded firmly, and the other warrior stepped back, though he continued to watch Jake with obvious distrust. My people think you must want something from us, Chief Theron said to Jake. They believe you are trying to trick us or that you hope to gain some advantage by helping my children. Jake shook his head. I don't want anything from you. I was just glad I could help. Chief Theron studied Jake's face carefully, as if looking for signs of deception. Jake met his gaze steadily, hoping his honesty would show through. Around them, the other warriors waited in tense silence for their leader's decision. You live here alone, Chief Theron observed, looking at Jake's rundown ranch. Your buildings are damaged, your animals are sick, and you have very little food. Yet you shared what you had with strange children and used expensive medicine to treat them. Jake felt embarrassed about the poor condition of his ranch, but he nodded. Things have been difficult lately, but that doesn't matter when someone needs help. Chief Theron looked around at the dying cattle and broken fences, then back at Jake. Something in his expression was changing, and Jake thought he saw a glimmer of understanding or maybe even approval. My children could have died in that river, Chief Theron said quietly. Without your help, I would have lost them both. Any parent would have done the same thing, Jake replied. No, Chief Theron said firmly. Not any parent, and not any human. We have encountered before. The chief turned and spoke to his warriors in their own language. Jake could not understand what he was saying, but he noticed that some of the weapons were being lowered and the rigid military formation was relaxing slightly. Chief Theron turned back to Jake. I came here prepared for battle, expecting to find my children held prisoner by a human who would demand payment for their return. Instead, I find a poor rancher who risked his life to save them and asks for nothing. Jake did not know what to say to that. He was starting to realize that this meeting was much more significant than he had thought. The way Chief Theron and his warriors were acting suggested that relations between humans and Kethra were usually hostile, or at least very tense. My children are safe because of you, Chief Theron continued. This creates a debt that must be acknowledged. Jake shook his head quickly. You don't owe me anything. I'm just happy they're okay. Chief Theron's eyes widened slightly at this response. He turned and said something to his warriors that caused a murmur of surprise to run through their ranks. Jake was beginning to understand that his attitude was very different from what they expected from humans. You continue to surprise me, Jake Morrison, Chief Theron said, and Jake realized the warrior had somehow learned his name. Perhaps it is time we talked about more than just the rescue of my children. Chief Theron gestured for Jake to sit on the steps of his front porch. The warrior chief sat across from him on a large rock, while Zara and Kess stayed close to their father, but continued to glance at Jake with friendly expressions. The other warriors maintained their positions but seemed less tense than before. Tell me about your ranch, Chief Theron said. How long have you been here and why do you struggle so much? Jake was surprised by the question but decided to be honest. He explained how he had come to New Montana 5 years ago, with dreams of building a successful ranch. He told the chief about the diseases that killed his crops and livestock, the equipment that constantly broke down, and the corporate buyers who wanted to take his land for almost nothing. Chief Theron listened carefully to everything Jake said. When Jake mentioned the sick cattle, the chief's expression became more serious. Your animals have the wasting sickness? I don't know what it's called. They get weak and stop eating, and then they die. I've lost 15 head in the past month. Chief Theron stood up and walked over to look at Jake's cattle. He studied them for several minutes, then returned with a grim expression. This is not a natural disease. Your animals have been poisoned. Jake felt his stomach drop. Poisoned? How? The water that feeds your creek comes from the northern hills. We have seen this sickness before in our own herds when the mining companies dump their waste into the streams. The poison builds up slowly in the animals until it kills them. Jake's mind raced as he processed this information. If the mining companies were poisoning the water, that explained not just his sick cattle but also why his crops had failed, and why he could never seem to make anything work on his ranch. Can it be stopped? Jake asked. Chief Theron's face was dark with anger. Not easily. The corporations have permits from your government to operate in those hills. They claim their waste is safe, but they lie. We have lost many animals and seen the forest sicken where their poison flows. Jake felt a mixture of anger and despair. He had blamed himself for failing as a rancher, but it turned out he was fighting against corporate pollution that he could not even see. Is that why your children were near the river? Were you trying to get away from the poisoned areas? Chief Theron nodded. We were moving our herds to cleaner water sources when the storm hit. Zara and Kess were helping to drive the animals when they were swept away by the flood. Jake looked at the two children who were playing quietly nearby. He realized that they and their people were facing the same problems he was, just from a different angle. The corporations were destroying the land for everyone who lived here. Chief Theron sat back down and looked directly at Jake. Now I will test your character, human. You have shown kindness to my children, but I must know what kind of man you truly are. Jake felt nervous, but nodded for the chief to continue. Chief Theron reached into a pouch on his belt and pulled out what looked like a handful of crystals. They were deep blue and seemed to glow with their own inner light. Jake had never seen anything like them. These are healing crystals from the deep caves of our territory, Chief Theron explained. They are very valuable to your people for their medical properties. One of these crystals is worth enough to buy 10 ranches like yours." Jake stared at the crystals, hardly believing what he was hearing. Chief Theron was holding what amounted to a fortune in his hands. "I offer you 3 of these crystals as payment for saving my children," Chief Theron said. "With this wealth, you could leave this planet and start a new life anywhere you choose." Jake looked at the crystals and felt tempted for a moment. With that much money, he could pay off all his debts, buy new equipment, maybe even find a place where the corporations had not poisoned the land. But something about the way Chief Theron was watching him made Jake think this was more than just a simple offer of payment. "What if I don't want to leave?" Jake asked. Chief Theron's eyes narrowed slightly. "Then I offer you something else. Safe passage to the spaceport and protection from any who might try to stop you. My warriors would escort you safely off this world." Again, Jake sensed this was some kind of test. Chief Theron was offering him 2 ways to escape his problems, but both involved leaving New Montana entirely. Jake thought about his ranch, his cattle, and the 5 years he had spent trying to build something here. "What if I want to stay and keep trying to make my ranch work?" Chief Theron leaned forward. "Then you are either very brave or very foolish. Why would you stay on a world where the corporations poison your land and steal your livelihood?" Jake looked around at his property, seeing it through Chief Theron's eyes. The broken buildings, the sick animals, the signs of constant struggle and failure. From the outside, it probably looked like madness to keep fighting. "Because this is my home," Jake said finally. "I came here to build something and I'm not ready to give up yet. Maybe I can't fight the corporations alone, but that doesn't mean I should just run away." Chief Theron was quiet for a long moment, studying Jake's face. Then, to Jake's surprise, he smiled. It was the first time Jake had seen any warmth in the warrior's expression. "You refuse wealth and safety to stay on a dying ranch and fight an enemy you cannot defeat alone." Chief Theron shook his head as if amazed. "My people were right to be suspicious of humans, but they were wrong about you." Jake was confused. "I don't understand." Chief Theron put the crystals back in his pouch. "Every human we have encountered on this world has wanted something from us. Money, land, resources, or safe passage through our territory. They see only what they can take or how they can profit. I'm not like that," Jake said. "No, you are not. You saved my children and asked for nothing. I offered you great wealth and you showed no greed. I offered you escape and you chose to stay and fight for what you believe in." Chief Theron stood up and looked out across Jake's ranch. "These are the qualities we respect among the Kethra." Jake felt a strange mixture of pride and confusion. He had not realized he was being tested, and he was not sure what it meant that he had apparently passed. Chief Theron turned back to him. "Tell me, Jake Morrison, what would you say if I told you that you do not have to fight the corporations alone?" "What do you mean?" "I mean that the Kethra face the same enemy you do. The mining companies poison our lands as much as yours. The corporations want to drive us from our territory so they can strip mine the entire continent." Jake began to see where this conversation was leading. "You're talking about working together. I am talking about an alliance between a poor human rancher and the mountain clans of the Kethra. You have shown that humans can be honorable and trustworthy. Perhaps it is time we found common ground against our common enemy." Jake felt his heart racing. An alliance with the Kethra could change everything, not just for him but for the future of human-Kethra relations on New Montana. But it would also be dangerous and unprecedented. "What would that look like?" Jake asked. Chief Theron smiled, again. And this time there was something almost fierce in his expression. "It would look like the beginning of something the corporations never expected to face. 2 species working together to protect the land we both call home." Jake looked at Zara and Kess, who were watching their father and Jake with bright, curious eyes. Then he looked back at Chief Theron, seeing not just a warrior, but a leader who was offering him something that could change his life in ways he had never imagined. "I'm interested," Jake said simply. Chief Theron nodded as if he had expected this answer. "Good. Then let us discuss how a poor rancher and a tribe of warriors might teach the corporations that some things are more important than profit." Chief Theron called several of his warriors over to join the conversation. Jake noticed that they moved with silent efficiency and showed great respect for their leader. When they gathered around, the chief introduced them in English for Jake's benefit. "This is Commander Lyra, my second-in-command and war leader. This is Elder Knox, our healer and keeper of wisdom. And this is Scout Raven, who knows the movements of the corporations better than anyone." Each warrior nodded to Jake as they were introduced. Jake could see curiosity in their eyes, and he sensed they were still trying to decide what to make of him. Commander Lyra was particularly watchful, her hand never straying far from her weapon. Elder Knox was older than the others, with silver streaks in his hair and scars that spoke of many battles. When he looked at Jake, his gaze was intense but not unfriendly. Scout Raven was smaller and quicker looking than the other warriors, with keen eyes that seemed to take in every detail of Jake's ranch. "Tell them what you told me about the poisoned water," Chief Theron said to Jake. Jake explained again about his sick cattle and failed crops, and how he had never understood what was causing the problems until now. The warriors listened carefully, and Jake noticed that Elder Knox's expression grew angrier as he heard the details. "The mining operation in the northern hills has expanded," Scout Raven said. "They are processing 3 times as much ore as they were last year. The wastewater flows directly into the streams that feed this valley. We have lost 12 breeding females and over 30 young ones to the same sickness," Elder Knox added. "Our herds are being forced to move farther and farther from traditional grazing areas to find clean water." Jake felt sick thinking about the extent of the damage. "How long has this been going on?" 2 years, Commander Lyra said, and her voice was full of controlled anger. "We have sent messages to the human authorities, but they claim the corporations are following all safety regulations." "The regulations were written by the corporations themselves," Chief Theron said bitterly. "They are allowed to dump poison as long as they file the proper reports." Jake shook his head in disgust. "Is there no way to stop them legally?" Scout Raven laughed, but there was no humor in it. "Legal means nothing when the judges are paid by the same companies that write the laws. We learned this when we tried to use your human courts to protect our lands." Elder Knox spoke up. "The corporations want all of us gone, human and Kethra alike. They cannot strip mine the land efficiently while we are here to witness their crimes and resist their expansion." Jake was beginning to understand the bigger picture. The corporations were not just trying to drive him off his ranch. They were conducting a slow campaign to clear the entire region of anyone who might interfere with their operations. "What about the government in the capital?" Jake asked. "Surely someone in authority would care about environmental destruction on this scale." Chief Theron exchanged glances with his warriors. "The planetary governor owns stock in 3 of the major mining companies. The environmental minister used to work for the largest corporation before taking his government position. The system is designed to serve corporate interests, not to protect the land or its people." Jake felt a deep anger building in his chest. He had spent 5 years blaming himself for his failures, thinking he was just not strong enough or smart enough to make his ranch work. Now he learned that he had been fighting against a rigged system from the beginning. "So what can we do?" Jake asked. Commander Lyra stepped forward. "We have been conducting what you might call guerrilla operations against the mining sites, sabotaging equipment, disrupting transportation, making their operations expensive and difficult. But we can only do so much without risking open war with the human authorities," Chief Theron added. "The government would use any major conflict as an excuse to declare martial law and remove us from our lands entirely." Jake could see the impossible position the Kethra were in. If they fought too hard, they would be labeled as terrorists and face the full military might of the human government. If they did not fight hard enough, the corporations would slowly destroy everything they cared about. "What if you had a human ally?" Jake asked. "Someone who could speak for you in human courts and help expose what the corporations are doing." Elder Knox raised an eyebrow. "You would do this?" "If it means stopping the poisoning of the land, yes. This affects me as much as it affects you." Scout. Raven looked skeptical. "No offense, but you are just one poor rancher. What influence could you have against corporations with unlimited money and political connections?" Jake had to admit that was a fair point. Maybe not much by myself, but what if we could prove what they're doing? Document the environmental damage, get samples of the poisoned water, show the connection between their operations and the dead animals. Chief Theron looked interested. You think evidence would matter to human authorities? It might if it was presented the right way. There are environmental groups on other planets that fight corporate pollution. If we could get their attention and support, it might put pressure on the local government. Commander Lyra shook her head. The corporations would just deny everything and claim the evidence was falsified. Not if we had inside information, Jake said, an idea forming in his mind. What if someone could get access to the mining operations and document what they're really doing? The warriors looked at each other with interest. Scout Raven spoke first. We have tried to infiltrate their facilities, but they use genetic scanners that can identify Kethra from miles away. They don't scan for humans, though, Jake pointed out. A human might be able to get closer, especially if he had a legitimate reason to be in the area. Chief Theron studied Jake carefully. You would be willing to spy on the corporations? This would be very dangerous. If they discovered what you were doing, they would not hesitate to kill you. Jake thought about his sick cattle, his failing ranch, and the 5 years of struggle that now made sense in a new and terrible way. They're already killing me slowly. At least this way I'd be fighting back. Elder Knox smiled for the first time since Jake had met him. You have courage, human. Perhaps there is hope for cooperation between our peoples after all. There is more, Chief Theron said. If we work together, we can offer each other things that neither of us has alone. You need help restoring your ranch and protecting your livestock. We need someone who can navigate human legal and political systems. Jake felt excitement building. What are you thinking? Our healers know how to cure the poison sickness in animals. Our builders know how to work with the natural environment instead of fighting against it. Our farmers know which crops will grow in this soil and which will fail. Commander Lyra added, in return, you could help us understand human technology and legal procedures. You could serve as our voice in situations where Kethra are not welcome or trusted. Jake looked around at the group of warriors and felt something he had not experienced in years. Hope. For the first time since coming to New Montana, he was not alone in his struggles. When do we start? Jake asked. Chief Theron smiled broadly. We start by healing your ranch and restoring your land. Then we plan our campaign against the corporations. But first we must make this alliance official. The chief stood and drew a knife from his belt. Jake tensed for a moment, but then he saw that Theron was offering him the handle. Among the Kethra, alliances are sealed with blood. Will you join your blood with mine to show that we are now family? Jake took the knife without hesitation. He made a small cut on his palm and handed the blade back to Chief Theron, who did the same. They clasped hands, mixing their blood while the other warriors watched solemnly. From this day forward, Chief Theron declared, Jake Morrison of the Morrison Ranch is brother to the mountain clans. His enemies are our enemies. His battles are our battles. His success is our success. Jake felt the weight and honor of those words. He was no longer just a struggling rancher fighting alone against impossible odds. He was part of something larger, something that might actually have the power to make a difference. As they broke apart, Zara and Kess came running over. Zara hugged Jake around the waist, and Kess said something in Kethra that made all the adults smile. He says you are now his second father, Chief Theron translated, and Zara has declared that she will help you learn to speak our language properly. Jake looked down at the two children who had changed his life simply by falling into a river, and then up at the warriors who were now his allies. For the first time in 5 years, Jake Morrison felt like he had a real chance at success. 6 months later, Jake stood on the porch of his rebuilt ranch house and looked out over green fields where healthy cattle grazed peacefully. The transformation was so complete that visitors often had trouble believing this was the same failing operation that had been dying just half a year ago. The changes had started immediately after the alliance was formed. Elder Knox had arrived with a team of Kethra healers who knew exactly how to treat the poison sickness in Jake's remaining cattle. Using a combination of natural medicines and energy treatments that Jake did not fully understand, they had saved every animal that was not already too far gone. More importantly, they had taught Jake how to recognize the early signs of poisoning and how to treat it before it became deadly. His cattle were now stronger and healthier than they had ever been, and he had not lost a single animal to sickness in 4 months. The Kethra builders had helped him repair and improve his ranch buildings, using techniques that worked with the planet's environment instead of fighting it. His house no longer leaked. His barn was stronger than ever, and his equipment shed was designed to protect his machinery from the electrical storms that had previously caused so much damage. Scout Raven had worked with Jake to plan and plant new crops that were suited to New Montana's soil and climate. His fields now produced enough food to feed both himself and several Kethra families, with surplus to trade in town for supplies and equipment. But the most important change was that Jake was no longer alone. Kethra warriors regularly patrolled the area around his ranch, and several families had established temporary camps nearby. Zara and Kes visited almost every day, and Jake was getting better at speaking their language thanks to their patient teaching. The investigation into the corporate pollution had been more successful than anyone had dared to hope. Using his status as a local rancher, Jake had been able to get access to several mining sites by claiming he was interested in selling them mineral rights to his land. What he had found and documented was worse than they had imagined. The corporations were not just dumping wastewater into the streams. They were using illegal chemical processes that were banned on most civilized worlds, and they were disposing of toxic materials in ways that would poison the land for generations. Jake had smuggled out water samples, recorded video of illegal dumping, and even copied internal corporate documents that proved the companies knew they were causing environmental damage, but had decided it was cheaper to pay fines than to follow proper safety procedures. The evidence had been sent to environmental groups on Earth and other core worlds, and the response had been immediate and dramatic. Investigative journalists had descended on New Montana, followed by government inspectors and environmental scientists. The story had become a galactic scandal that even the corrupt local government could not ignore. 3 major mining operations had been shut down, and several corporate executives were facing criminal charges. The cleanup effort would take years, but the flow of poison into the water system had finally been stopped. The success of the investigation had also transformed human-Kethra relations across the planet. Jake's alliance with Chief Theron had inspired other humans to reach out to their Kethra neighbors, and several cooperative agreements had been signed in other regions. Jake walked down from his porch to where Chief Theron was teaching Kes how to repair a hoverbike. The boy's arm had healed completely, and he was becoming quite skilled with human technology. Zara was nearby, helping Commander Lyra plan patrol routes on Jake's new computer system. "The Harvest Festival is next week," Chief Theron said as Jake approached. "The elders have decided you should be the guest of honor." Jake felt honored but embarrassed. "I don't think I deserve that. This alliance has helped me more than anyone else." Chief Theron stood up and put a hand on Jake's shoulder. "You saved my children when you could have ignored their cries for help. You shared your food when you had almost nothing. You risked your life to expose the corporations when you could have taken their money and left the planet. You would have done the same thing," Jake said. "Perhaps. But the point is that you did do it, and you did it when no one would have blamed you for thinking only of yourself." Chief Theron looked around at the thriving ranch. "This place is proof that humans and Kethra can work together to build something better than either could create alone." Jake had to admit that was true. His ranch was now more successful than he had ever dreamed possible when he was struggling alone. The combination of human technology and Kethra knowledge had created something unique and powerful. A young Kethra warrior approached and spoke to Chief Theron in their language. The chief nodded and turned back to Jake. "More good news. The planetary governor has announced that he will not seek re-election, and the leading candidate to replace him is promising major environmental reforms." Jake smiled. Amazing how quickly politicians discover environmental protection when the whole galaxy is watching. Indeed. And there is other news as well. The Earth Environmental Council wants to establish a permanent monitoring station here, to study our cooperative farming and ranching methods. They think what we have accomplished could be a model for other frontier worlds. Jake felt a surge of pride. They had not just saved their own land. They had created something that might help other people facing similar challenges across the galaxy. Zara came running over with a data pad in her hands. Jake, look at this. The story about our alliance has been translated into 16 different languages and broadcast on 47 worlds. Jake took the pad and saw headlines in languages he could not read, but the pictures told the story clearly. Images of him and Chief Theron shaking hands, of human and Kethra children playing together, of the restored ranch and healthy cattle. "We are famous," Kess announced proudly, his English much improved from 6 months ago. "You are all famous," Jake corrected. "This only worked because everyone was willing to trust each other and work together." Chief Theron nodded thoughtfully. "It is strange to think that a flood that nearly killed my children has led to the most successful alliance between our peoples in 50 years. Jake looked at Zara and Kess, who were now more like his own children than guests. Sometimes the worst disasters create the best opportunities. If they had not fallen into that river, none of this would have happened. "Fate," Elder Knox said, approaching the group with his arms full of medicinal plants from Jake's new herb garden. "The spirits of the land brought us together for a purpose." Jake was not sure he believed in fate or spirits, but he had to admit that the timing of everything had been remarkably fortunate. If the storm had come a day earlier or later, if he had been in town instead of at the ranch, if he had decided, the risk was too great to attempt a rescue. Everything would have been different. A communication device on Jake's belt chimed with an incoming message. He looked at the display and smiled. "It's from the University on Earth. They want to send a research team to study our agricultural techniques." "How many people?" Chief Theron asked. 12 scientists and graduate students. They want to stay for 6 months. Chief Theron grinned. "We will have to build more guest houses. This ranch is becoming quite the popular destination." Jake looked around at his transformed home, at the thriving fields and healthy animals, at the mixed group of humans and Kethra, who now worked together as naturally as if they had always been allies. It was far more than he had ever hoped for when he first came to New Montana with nothing but dreams and determination. The sun was setting, painting the sky in brilliant shades of purple and gold. The twin moons were rising, and the first stars were appearing in the darkening sky. Jake could hear the sounds of laughter and conversation as humans and Kethra worked together to prepare the evening meal. "You know," Jake said to Chief Theron, "when I pulled your children out of that river, I thought I was just saving 2 lives. I never imagined it would change everything." Chief Theron put his arm around Jake's shoulders in a gesture that had become natural between them. "The best changes always start with simple acts of kindness. You saw children in danger and helped them, not because of who they were or what you might gain, but because it was the right thing to do." Zara and Kess ran up to them, excited about something they had discovered in the herb garden. As they chattered in their mixture of English and Kethra, Jake felt a deep satisfaction that had nothing to do with the success of his ranch or the fame of their alliance. He had found his place in the galaxy, not as a struggling rancher fighting, alone against impossible odds, but as part of a family that included 2 species working together to build a better future. It was more than he had ever dared to dream, and it had all started with the simple decision to help 2 children in trouble. The poor rancher who had once faced 100 warriors at dawn was now surrounded by friends and allies who would stand with him against any challenge. Jake Morrison had finally found the success he had been seeking, but it had come in a form he never could have imagined.